The morning air in the Ardennes forest carries the metallic taste of snow and cordite. It's December 16th, 1944, and Staff Sergeant Robert Callahan crouches in a frozen foxhole near Bastogne, the SCR-300 radio strapped to his back like a second spine. His forward observer, Lieutenant James Morrison, scans the tree line through binoculars, breath forming small clouds in the sub-zero air. They've been in position since 0400 hours, watching the main road that leads into the village. Morrison sees them first. German infantry, moving in company strength through the morning fog. Perhaps 200 men, their field grey uniforms barely distinguishable from the winter landscape. They're advancing in textbook formation, confident, unhurried. Behind them, the distinctive silhouette of a Panzer IV tank emerges from the mist. Morrison doesn't shout. He doesn't panic. He simply lifts the handset to his lips and speaks, his voice steady and measured. Fire mission. Grid 527418. High explosive, will adjust. 15 seconds, that's all the transmission takes. 15 seconds of calm, precise language transmitted through the backpack radio on Callahan's spine. The Germans continue their advance, unaware that they've just been sentenced to death. 93 seconds later, the world becomes fire and steel. The first salvo of 105mm shells lands among the German infantry with surgical precision. The Panzer attempts to reverse, its commander finally understanding the danger, but the second salvo finds it before it can escape. Morrison makes a minor adjustment, drop 50, fire for effect, and the artillery fire walks systematically through the German formation like the finger of an angry god. When the barrage lifts, 3 minutes after Morrison's initial call, 147 German soldiers are dead or wounded. The Panzer is a burning hulk. The survivors flee, back into the forest, their attack shattered before it truly began. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across Western Europe between June 1944 and May 1945. And the Germans, despite their tactical sophistication and technological prowess, never truly understood what was killing them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the SCR-300 radio is not merely a tale of technological advancement. It is a story about the invisible revolution that transformed modern warfare, a revolution so subtle that one side didn't realize it was happening until the war was already lost. It's about how a 38-pound backpack radio became more deadly than the Tiger tank, more decisive than the V-2 rocket, and more feared by German soldiers than American fighter bombers. But to understand why this radio was so devastating, we must first understand the world of artillery coordination before it existed, a world where calling down fire from the heavens required elaborate rituals of communication that consumed precious minutes while men died. The year is 1942. The Americans are still learning the brutal arithmetic of modern war. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, inexperienced American units face veteran German formations under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The Americans have numerical superiority in artillery. Their industrial capacity ensures this, but they cannot bring that firepower to bear effectively. The problem is communication. A forward observer spots a German tank formation. He's positioned perhaps 1,000 yards ahead of the main American line, hidden in a rocky outcrop with a clear view of the valley below. He can see the targets. He knows their exact location. But he cannot speak directly to the artillery batteries 5 miles behind him. Instead, he must relay his information through a chain of intermediaries. First, he shouts coordinates to his radio operator, who carries an SCR-284 radio set. This radio weighs 75 pounds and requires a vehicle for transport. If they're lucky enough to have the radio with them, and if it hasn't been destroyed by German counter-battery fire, the operator transmits to a relay station at battalion headquarters. Battalion plots the coordinates on their map, verifies them, then calls the Fire Direction Center at division level. The Fire Direction Center calculates firing data range, azimuth, charge, elevation, and transmits orders to the gun batteries. The gun crews receive the order, adjust their pieces, load the shells, and fire. Time elapsed, 12 to 18 minutes. In 12 minutes, the German tanks had moved. They've shifted position, perhaps taken cover, perhaps completed their own attack. The shells land on empty ground. The observer must repeat the entire process, calling corrections that will take another 12 minutes to implement. This is not warfare. This is archaeology. By the time the shells arrive, the observer is excavating the past, trying to hit targets that existed a quarter hour ago. The Germans understand this. Their doctrine emphasizes speed and maneuver precisely because they know that American artillery, while abundant, is too slow to catch moving targets. German commanders train their units to advance in short, violent rushes, to attack and withdraw before the American fire support can respond. And it works. At Kasserine Pass, the Germans inflict 6,000 casualties on the Americans, while suffering fewer than 1,000 themselves. The American artillery, theoretically the Army's greatest advantage, fires thousands of shells, but achieves little because it cannot respond quickly enough to the fluid battlefield. But the Americans are nothing if not adaptive. They recognize the problem. They see that their artillery is magnificent in set-piece battles, in pre-planned barrages against known targets, but ineffective in mobile warfare. And they begin to ask a dangerous question. What if we could give every infantry officer the ability to speak directly to the guns? The answer arrives in late 1943, manufactured at plants in New York and Chicago, shipped across the Atlantic in convoy, and distributed to combat units preparing for the invasion of Normandy. It's called the SCR-300, and it looks deceptively simple. A metal box, a telescoping antenna, a handset, total weight with batteries, 38 pounds. But simplicity is sophistication. The SCR-300 represents a fundamental reimagining of battlefield communication. It operates on frequency modulation radio waves between 40 and 48 MHz. Unlike amplitude modulation radios, FM transmission is resistant to static, to interference, to the electromagnetic chaos of modern war. The signal is clear. The range is 3 to 5 miles depending on terrain. One man can carry it on his back, and critically, it allows voice communication, not Morse code, not written messages relayed through channels. Voice. A human being speaking directly to another human being, bypassing all the intermediaries, all the delays, all the opportunities for miscommunication. The technical specifications tell only part of the story. The true innovation lies in the doctrine that surrounds this device. The United States Army creates a new specialization, the forward observer. These are not ordinary soldiers. They are hand-picked for intelligence, for mathematical aptitude, for unshakable calm under fire. They attend schools where they learn to read topographical maps with the precision of surveyors. They practice estimating ranges by eye until they can guess the distance to a target within 50 yards. They memorize firing tables and ballistic charts. They drill endlessly in the compressed language of fire missions until they can transmit a complete order in under 20 seconds. Fire mission, infantry in the open, grid 527418, high explosive, will adjust, 21 words, 15 seconds. Everything the artillery needs to know. Compare this to the German system. The Wehrmacht has forward observers too. They use the Tornister Empfänger radio, which is theoretically similar to the SCR-300 inches concept. But German artillery doctrine remains centralized. Fire missions must be approved at division level. Forward observers can request fire, but they cannot command it. The emphasis is on pre-planned barrages, on methodical preparation, on the German faith in thorough staff work. This difference, this seemingly minor doctrinal distinction will prove catastrophic. But the Germans don't know this yet. In the early 1944, as they prepared their defences along the French coast, they believed they understood American capabilities. They've fought the Americans in North Africa and Italy. They've seen American artillery. It's abundant but slow, powerful but inflexible. The German defensive doctrine accounts for this. Hold fixed positions until American units commit to an attack, then counterattack against their flanks before their artillery can respond. It's a good plan. It worked in Tunisia. It worked in Italy. It will fail catastrophically in France. On Omaha Beach, American forward observers wade ashore with the first waves, SCR-300 radios on their backs, often soaked with seawater and miraculously still functional. By mid-morning, they're calling fire missions from positions barely 200 yards from the German bunkers. The German defenders at Omaha are experienced troops, many veterans of the Eastern Front. They've seen Soviet human wave attacks. They've weathered massive artillery barrages. They know how to fight, but they've never experienced anything like this. An American platoon takes cover behind the seawall, pinned by machine gun fire, from a concrete bunker. In 1942, they would be stuck there, waiting for tanks or demolition teams. In 1944, the forward observer lifts his handset. 90 seconds later, the bunker receives a direct hit from a destroyer offshore, the naval gunfire directed by the man crouching behind the seawall. This happens again, and again, and again. Each German strongpoint that reveals itself by firing receives precision artillery or naval gunfire within 2 minutes. The Germans begin to realize that firing their weapons marks them for death. Machine gun crews start abandoning their positions after a single burst, knowing what comes next. By nightfall on D-Day, American forces have secured footholds on all 5 beaches. The casualty rates are horrific, nearly 10,000 American casualties on June 6 alone, but they're far below German predictions. The Germans expected the invasion to fail or to be contained on the beaches for days. Instead, American forces are moving inland within hours. German commanders file reports that betray their confusion. An officer of the 352nd Infantry Division writes, "American artillery response times are incomprehensible. We fire on their positions, they return fire within 2 minutes. This should not be possible given known American radio equipment specifications. We suspect new technology, or perhaps coordination with aerial observers, though cloud cover makes this unlikely. They suspect new technology. They suspect aerial observers. They don't suspect a backpack radio and 15 seconds. The Battle of Normandy grinds through June and July. The Americans advance slowly through the bocage country small fields, divided by ancient earthen walls topped with thick hedgerows. It's the defenders' terrain. Each field is a fortress. Each hedgerow conceals machine guns and mortars. The Germans inflict heavy casualties. American progress is measured in hundreds of yards per day. But the SCR-300 makes even this brutal fighting sustainable. Every time a German position reveals itself, forward observers call fire. The artillery has ammunition to spare. American logistics are that good, and they fire whenever called upon. Slowly, methodically, the Americans blast their way through the bocage. A German soldier captured in early July near Saint-Lô provides a glimpse into the German experience. We cannot establish defensive positions during the day. Within minutes of occupying a position, American artillery finds us. We believe they have perfected a method of detection we cannot counter. Some men believe the Americans can see through walls or detect our body heat. The effect on morale is significant. They think it's magic. They think it's some secret technology. It's a man with a radio and a clear line of sight. By late July, the Americans broke out of Normandy. Operation Cobra shatters the German defensive line, and American armoured divisions pour through the gap. Now, the SCR-300 shows its true potential. Forward observers ride in jeeps and tanks with the advanced elements. When the columns encounter resistance, they don't slow down. They call fire. 90 seconds later, the resistance ceases to exist. The columns advance. The Germans try to counterattack. They massed panzer divisions at Mortain in early August, attempting to cut off the American breakthrough. It's a bold plan, but it requires concentrating forces. And concentrated forces are visible. American forward observers call fire missions by the dozen. Artillery from multiple divisions converges on the German concentration. Fighter bombers join in, directed by forward air controllers, essentially forward observers for air power, using the same SCR-300 radios. The German counterattack collapses under a storm of high explosive that arrives faster than the Germans can react. By mid-August, the German army in Normandy is trapped in the Falaise pocket. Over 50,000 Germans surrender. The roads are choked with destroyed vehicles. And German after-action reports, when they're written at all, keep returning to the same theme. American artillery response times are beyond comprehension. A staff officer from the 7th Army wrote in late August, "The Americans appear to coordinate artillery at the company level or below. This contradicts all known doctrine. We have captured American radio equipment but cannot deduce from the specifications alone how they achieve such rapid response. The psychological effect on our troops is severe. Men refuse to establish positions in daylight hours when American infantry is near." The Germans captured SCR-300 radios. They examined them. They analyzed them. But they couldn't understand the system because they couldn't imagine giving that much authority to a lieutenant or sergeant. German military culture was built on centralization, on staff officers making decisions, on thorough planning. The idea that a forward observer, essentially a junior officer or even an enlisted man, could independently call artillery fire was alien to German doctrine, so they looked for technological explanations: new detection systems, radar, infrared sensors, something that explained how the Americans found targets so quickly. They never considered that the answer was simply trust. The Americans trusted their forward observers. They gave them authority. They built a system where a sergeant could speak and batteries 5 miles away would fire within 90 seconds, no questions asked. This trust was not blind. Forward observers trained for months. They were tested rigorously. Those who couldn't perform were reassigned. But those who proved capable received extraordinary authority, the authority to call down death from the sky with 15 seconds of speech. The autumn of 1944 brings the war to Germany's doorstep. American forces cross into the Reich itself, and the character of the fighting changes. The Germans are no longer fighting for conquest or ideology alone. They're fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence. Desperation breeds ferocity. The Wehrmacht, battered and depleted, fights with a tenacity that surprises even veteran American commanders. But desperation cannot overcome mathematics. And the mathematics of the SCR-300 system is inexorable. Consider the Battle of Aachen, October 1944, the first German city to fall to the Allies. The Germans declare it a fortress, ordering the garrison to fight to the last man. The city becomes a maze of rubble and booby traps, every building a potential strong point, every cellar a bunker. Urban warfare at its most brutal. In previous wars, such a defense would have been nearly impregnable. Attacking forces would be channeled into killing zones, subjected to enfilading fire from multiple positions, worn down in savage close-quarters combat. The defenders, knowing the terrain intimately, would exact a horrific toll. The Americans approach Aachen differently. They don't charge into the killing zones. Instead, forward observers accompany every company-sized assault. When a German position reveals itself, a machine gun opening fire from a shattered building, mortars launching from a concealed courtyard, the Americans take cover and call fire. The artillery arrives within 2 minutes. Not small-caliber mortars, but full-sized 105mm and 155mm howitzer shells. Buildings collapse. Concrete walls shatter. The German position ceases to exist. Then the Americans advance to the next block and repeat the process. A German defender who survived the battle later described it this way: "We could not hold any position once the Americans identified it. We would fire, thinking we had caught them in the open, and within moments their artillery would land on our position with uncanny accuracy. We learned to fire only a few shots before abandoning our positions, but this made defense impossible. We were reduced to sniping and running, which cannot hold a city." The Battle of Aachen lasts 19 days. American casualties are significant, approximately 5,000 men, but far below the predictions for urban combat against a determined enemy. The German garrison is effectively destroyed. Nearly 6,000 Germans die, and another 5,000 surrender. The key factor: American forward observers call over 3,000 fire missions during the battle. 3,000 times, German positions are identified and destroyed within minutes. The Germans cannot establish a coherent defense because the Americans can demolish any strong point as soon as it reveals itself. But the true test of the SCR-300 system comes in December 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The German offensive that history will call the Battle of the Bulge begins before dawn on December 16th. It's Hitler's last gamble in the West: throw 25 divisions at a weakly held sector of the American line, break through to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, force a negotiated peace. The plan is desperate, perhaps delusional, but the initial attack achieves complete surprise. German forces hit American positions held by inexperienced or depleted units. Entire regiments are overrun. Communications break down. Command posts are captured. In the chaos and darkness and fog, German armor penetrates deep into American lines. For 3 days, it appears the offensive might succeed. American units retreat in confusion. Supply dumps are abandoned. Headquarters staff burns classified documents and prepares to evacuate. The Germans advance 30 miles in some sectors, creating a bulge in the American line that gives the battle its name. But even in the chaos of those first days, the SCR-300 system continues to function. Forward observers, separated from their units, surrounded by German forces, continue to call fire missions. Artillery units, displaced from their positions, set up new firing points and continue to respond. On December 17th, a forward observer team from the 2nd Infantry Division found itself behind German lines near Krinkelt-Rocherath. They were overrun by the German assault but managed to escape into the forest with their SCR-300 intact. From their hiding position in a ravine, they observe a column of German tanks and infantry moving west along a main road. The observer, First Lieutenant Jack Doherty, calls fire. His radio operator, Corporal Michael Chen, transmits the coordinates to their battalion, assuming the battalion still exists, assuming someone is still at the fire direction center, assuming the guns haven't been overrun. 98 seconds later, artillery fire lands on the road. The Germans scatter, seeking cover. Doherty adjusts. Left 200, add 50, fire for effect. The second salvo lands among the German vehicles. A fuel truck explodes. Tanks attempt to maneuver off the road, but several bog down in the soft ground beside the roadway. For 11 minutes, Doherty directs fire onto the German column. When they finally run German infantry, sweeping the forest for the observers who must be nearby, they leave behind 14 destroyed vehicles and an estimated 200 casualties. This scene repeats itself across the Ardennes. Individual forward observers, cut off and surrounded, continue to call fire. The Germans cannot advance without being observed, and being observed means being destroyed. By December 20th, the German offensive had stalled. Not stopped completely. Fighting will continue until late January, but stalled. The Germans have advanced, but failed to achieve breakthroughs. They've captured territory, but not the critical supply depots. They've inflicted casualties, but not broken American morale, and the artillery has been decisive. During the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery fired over 1 million shells. German sources estimate that 60–70% of their casualties come from artillery fire. The SCR-300 forward observers call thousands of missions, providing the targeting data that makes this enormous expenditure of ammunition effective rather than wasteful. A captured German officer, interrogated in late December, provides insight into the German perspective. We were told American forces were demoralized, that they would break easily under determined assault. This was incorrect. What we encountered was not poor morale, but rather a system we could not overcome. Every time we concentrated forces for an attack, we received artillery fire within minutes. Every time we established an observation post or command center, it was destroyed shortly after beginning operations. We learned that the Americans could somehow detect our positions almost instantly, though we never determined the mechanism. The mechanism was a 38-pound radio and 15 seconds of speech. But the German officer, even in captivity, couldn't imagine that the answer was so simple. He kept searching for a complex technological explanation because his doctrine couldn't accommodate the idea that Americans gave such authority to junior officers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The spring of 1945 brings the final phase of the war in Europe. The Germans are beaten but not yet broken. They fight with the desperation of men who know defeat is inevitable but hope to delay it long enough for some miracle to save them. Every river becomes a defensive line. Every village becomes a fortress. The fighting is bitter, costly, and ultimately futile. The Americans cross the Rhine in March. The great river barrier that protected Germany for centuries is breached in multiple places. Engineers throw pontoon bridges across the water in hours. Armour pours through, and with the armour come the forward observers, their SCR-300 radios ready, scanning for targets. The crossing at Remagen is particularly instructive. On March 7th, elements of the 9th Armoured Division discovered that the Ludendorff Bridge was still intact. The Germans failed to demolish it completely. American forces seize the bridge and begin pouring across. The Germans, recognizing the disaster, throw everything at the crossing: artillery, rockets, jets carrying bombs. They must destroy the bridge, or the American lodgment on the east bank will become a flood. But American forward observers establish positions on both sides of the river. When German artillery opens fire, trying to hit the bridge, the observers triangulate the firing positions and call counter-battery fire. When German forces mass for counterattacks, the observers call fire missions that break up the attacks before they can develop. In 10 days, the Americans expanded the Remagen bridgehead to 15 miles deep and 20 miles wide. They pour 5 divisions across the Rhine. The German attempts to eliminate the bridgehead failed completely. American casualties are relatively light, fewer than 3,000, despite the Germans throwing everything they have at the crossing. The SCR-300 observers called over 1,200 fire missions in those 10 days. The artillery fires continuously, shells arriving from batteries on both sides of the Rhine. The Germans cannot mass force, cannot establish firing positions, cannot coordinate effective counterattacks. They're fighting blind while the Americans see everything. A German artillery commander, captured near Remagen in late March, expressed it this way: "We attempted to range our guns on the bridge, but could not maintain firing positions long enough to adjust our fire properly. As soon as we fired, American counter-battery fire would arrive on our position. We changed positions frequently, but the result was always the same." We concluded that the Americans had perfected some method of instantly locating artillery positions, perhaps through sound ranging or flash detection. Whatever the method, it made effective artillery operation impossible. Sound ranging and flash detection were technologies both sides used, but they required multiple observation posts and significant calculation time. What the German commander experienced was simply forward observers spotting his muzzle flashes and calling fire missions. 90 seconds from German gun firing to American shells landing on that gun. No complex technology, no elaborate calculations, just eyes and radios and trust. By April, the war enters its final phase. The German army is disintegrating. Entire divisions surrender, supply lines collapse. But even in collapse, pockets of resistance remain: fanatics, diehards, units that haven't received surrender orders, or simply soldiers with nowhere else to go. The Americans systematically reduce these pockets, and the SCR-300 makes the process almost mechanical. Identify resistance, call fire, destroy resistance, advance, repeat. The efficiency is almost terrible to contemplate. In the final month of the war, American artillery fired more shells than in any previous month. The guns are worn out, barrels eroded by tens of thousands of rounds. But they keep firing, and the forward observers keep calling missions. The system functions with industrial precision. A German soldier captured in the Ruhr pocket in mid-April told his interrogators, "We knew the war was lost, everyone knew, but we could not surrender because there was no one to surrender to. The Americans destroyed any position from a distance before approaching. We could not contact them to offer surrender without exposing ourselves to artillery fire. It was a strange situation. We wished to surrender but could not determine how. This captures something essential about what the SCR-300 system had become. It wasn't just a tool for calling artillery fire, it had evolved into a machine for processing the battlefield, for converting observation into destruction with such speed that the enemy had no time to react, no opportunity to negotiate, no choice but death or flight. The psychological impact on German survivors was profound. In interviews conducted after the war, German veterans consistently identified American artillery as the most frightening aspect of fighting the Western Allies. Not tanks, not aircraft, artillery, and specifically the speed and accuracy of American artillery response. One veteran described lying in a foxhole during the Rhineland campaign, listening to American forward observers talking on their radios. The Germans could sometimes overhear the transmissions if they were close enough. The voices were so calm, he recalled, like men ordering supplies or discussing the weather. No emotion, no fear, and then the shells would arrive and the world would end. The calmness was somehow more terrifying than if they had been screaming or angry. It was professional, industrial. We were not enemies to be defeated but problems to be solved. This industrial quality, this mechanization of violence, represented something new in warfare. Previous artillery systems required human decision-making at multiple points, approvals, calculations, orders flowing through channels. The SCR-300 system compressed all of that into 15 seconds of speech and 90 seconds of execution. It removed the friction from the process, the human hesitation, the moments when commanders might question or delay. The Germans, for all their technical sophistication, never developed an equivalent system. They captured SCR-300 radios, they analyzed the technology. Some German units even used captured American equipment, but they never adopted the doctrine. They never restructured their artillery to allow direct calls from forward observers. They never gave that authority to junior officers. Why not? This question haunted German commanders after the war. They understood, eventually, what the Americans had done. They recognized that the SCR-300 system wasn't about the radio itself, but about the organizational trust that surrounded it. But they couldn't replicate it. Part of the explanation is cultural. The German military tradition emphasized centralized control, staff planning, and methodical operations. The idea of giving a lieutenant or sergeant the authority to command battalion-level fire support was deeply uncomfortable. What if they made mistakes? What if they called fire on friendly positions? What if they wasted ammunition on unimportant targets? These were legitimate concerns. The American system did have risks. Forward observers did occasionally make mistakes. Friendly fire incidents happened. But the Americans accepted these risks as the price of speed. They understood that a system that could respond in 90 seconds would inevitably make some errors, but those errors were acceptable compared to a system that took 15 minutes and often missed entirely. The Germans never made that calculation. They valued precision over speed, control over flexibility, and in the context of World War II, this was fatal. The Americans didn't need perfection. They needed volume and speed. They had the industrial capacity to fire hundreds of thousands of shells. The SCR-300 system allowed them to direct that firepower with sufficient accuracy to be devastating. There's a deeper irony here. The Germans pioneered many of the tactical innovations of World War II. Blitzkrieg, combined arms warfare, close air support, these were German concepts, executed brilliantly in Poland and France and the early years in Russia. The Germans understood how to integrate different combat arms, how to use tanks and aircraft and infantry in coordination, but they never quite understood how to democratize that integration. German combined arms warfare required elaborate coordination, careful planning, officers at multiple levels making decisions. It worked brilliantly when they had time to plan and when things went according to plan. The Americans took the concept and simplified it. They gave every infantry lieutenant access to artillery. They made combined arms warfare a reflex rather than a plan, and in doing so, they created a system that was less elegant but more robust, less precise, but more adaptable. The SCR-300 was the physical embodiment of this philosophy. It wasn't the best radio in the world. German engineers could have built something similar or better if they'd chosen to. But the Americans built it and, more importantly, they built an entire system around it, training, doctrine, organizational trust that made it effective. This is what technology means in warfare. Not the device itself, but the system that employs it. The Germans had radar and jet engines and ballistic missiles, technologies more sophisticated than anything the Americans fielded in Europe. But they lost the war anyway because they couldn't build systems that turned technological potential into battlefield effectiveness. The Americans had the SCR-300, a simple radio, 38 pounds, range of 5 miles, and they built a system where that radio could call down the wrath of heaven in 15 seconds. That system, that combination of technology, doctrine, training, and trust, won battles more decisively than any wonder weapon. The war in Europe ends on May 8, 1945. The guns fall silent. The forward observers pack their SCR-300 radios for the last time. The artillery batteries, their barrels worn smooth from firing hundreds of thousands of rounds, stand idle. In the sudden quiet, soldiers on both sides begin the difficult process of returning to a world at peace. But the legacy of those 15 seconds, those brief transmissions that brought death with such precision, continues to echo through military history in ways the men who used them could never have imagined. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the United States military conducts extensive after-action analyses. Officers compile reports. Researchers interview veterans. The goal is to understand what worked, what failed, what lessons can be extracted from 4 years of brutal combat. And one conclusion emerges with absolute clarity. The SCR-300 forward observer system represents a fundamental breakthrough in warfare. The statistics are remarkable. American artillery fired approximately 30 million rounds during the European campaign. Of these, forward observers directed approximately 42%, nearly 13 million rounds. The kill ratio for forward observer-directed fire was roughly 4 times higher than for pre-planned or map-based fire missions. A shell, directed by a forward observer with a clear view of the target, was 4 times more likely to achieve a military effect than a shell fired based on map coordinates alone. This efficiency had strategic implications. The Germans, despite fielding fewer guns with less ammunition, might have achieved parity with American artillery if the American fire had remained as slow and imprecise as it was in 1942. But the SCR-300 system transformed quantity into quality. American artillery wasn't just abundant, it was accurate, responsive, and devastating. The psychological impact proved equally significant. Post-war surveys of German prisoners of war consistently ranked American artillery as the most feared weapon system they faced. More than tanks, which could be heard and avoided. More than aircraft, which came and went. Artillery was omnipresent, inescapable, and arrived without warning. The knowledge that any position could be destroyed within minutes of being observed created a pervasive anxiety that eroded German combat effectiveness. One German veteran, interviewed in 1946, described the psychological toll. "We learned not to trust any position, not concrete bunkers, not cellars, not foxholes. If the Americans could see us, we would be destroyed. So we moved constantly, never staying in one place more than an hour if American infantry was nearby. This prevented rest, prevented sleep, and prevented effective defense. The physical casualties from artillery were terrible, but the mental exhaustion from constant movement and fear was perhaps worse. This terror had a name in German military slang that emerged during the war: Funkerhölle, radio hell. German soldiers came to associate the presence of American forward observers with certain death. They learned to watch for the antennas of the SCR-300, the distinctive telescoping rods that marked the position of American forward observers. Killing the radio operator became a priority, second only to self-preservation. But the Americans protected their forward observers carefully. These men were too valuable to risk unnecessarily. They typically operated from covered positions, using binoculars and periscopes to observe without exposing themselves. Radio operators learned to keep their antennas low, to mask their transmissions, to move immediately after calling fire. The German countermeasure killing the observers proved difficult to execute in practice. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, took careful note of the SCR-300 system. Soviet military observers attached to American units filed detailed reports on the forward observer doctrine. After the war, the Soviets developed their own version of the system, adapting American principles to Soviet organizational structures. The R-105 radio, introduced in the late 1940s, was essentially a Soviet copy of the SCR-300, slightly heavier but functionally similar. But the Soviets learned something the Germans never accepted. The radio alone meant nothing without the doctrine. Soviet artillery doctrine evolved to emphasize responsive fire, to give forward observers significant authority, to value speed over elaborate staff coordination. The transformation took years and met resistance from traditionalists, but by the 1950s, the Soviet military had fully internalized the lessons of the SCR-300. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to refine their system. The Korean War saw the introduction of the AN/PRC-10, a lighter and more reliable successor to the SCR-300. The Vietnam War brought the PRC-25, the famous Prick-25, which became so ubiquitous that virtually every infantry squad carried one. The technology evolved, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Give forward observers direct voice communication with artillery. Minimize response time, and trust junior leaders to make tactical decisions. This principle, this democratization of firepower, transformed not just artillery but all fire support. Forward air controllers began using the same radios and similar procedures to direct close air support. Naval gunfire liaison officers adapted the system for ship-based fire support. The modern concept of joint fires, the integration of artillery, naval gunfire, close air support, and even helicopter gunships into a unified system responsive to ground commanders descends directly from the SCR-300 forward observer doctrine. The technology continued to evolve. By the 1980s, forward observers carried laser designators that could mark targets for precision-guided munitions. By the 2000s, they had GPS receivers that could determine their position and the target position to within meters. Digital fire control systems automated the calculations that human beings once performed with maps and slide rules. Modern artillery can receive a fire mission and have shells in the air within 30 seconds. But the core principle remains the same. A trained observer on the ground, with eyes on the target, communicating directly with the fire support assets, able to bring destruction down upon the enemy with minimal delay. The technology has become more sophisticated, but the concept, the idea that emerged with the SCR-300 inches, 1944, remains foundational to modern warfare. There's a human cost to this efficiency that deserves acknowledgement. The men who served as forward observers during World War II carried a unique psychological burden. They were not pulling triggers or pushing buttons in the heat of combat. They were speaking calmly into microphones, using clinical language to describe the destruction of other human beings. The emotional distance created by the radio system speaking to unseen gun crews miles away, watching death arrive from an impersonal distance, created a strange moral space. Some forward observers found this distance comforting. They could do their jobs without directly confronting the human consequences. Others found it disturbing, felt complicit in an industrial killing process that reduced warfare to mere procedure. Post-war studies of combat trauma found that forward observers had distinctive psychological profiles, different from both frontline infantry and rear echelon support troops. They occupied a middle space physically present at the front, but emotionally and practically removed from direct combat. Lieutenant James Morrison, the forward observer mentioned at the beginning of this account, survived the war. He returned to civilian life, became a civil engineer, and lived to the age of 83. In a 1998 interview conducted by a military historian, he reflected on his wartime service. I called fire missions that killed hundreds, perhaps thousands of men. I did this while eating a chocolate bar, while smoking a cigarette, while having casual conversations with my radio operator between missions. The calmness we maintained was professional, necessary for accuracy, but also deeply unnatural. You train yourself not to think about the human beings dying at the coordinates you're transmitting. If you thought about it too much, you couldn't do the job. War, you remember. You always remember. This moral complexity, the transformation of killing into a technical procedure executed with bureaucratic efficiency, represents something profoundly modern about the SCR-300 system. Previous warfare required men to confront their enemies directly, to overcome natural inhibitions against killing through rage or fear or immediate self-defense. The SCR-300 system allowed killing at a distance, with calm professionalism, as a simple technical problem to be solved. This wasn't entirely new. Artillery had always created distance between killers and victims. But the SCR-300 made that distance intimate in a strange way. The forward observer could see his targets, could watch them die, but was physically removed from the killing. He was witness and executioner simultaneously, present and absent, responsible and detached. The Germans, in their post-war analyses, eventually understood what had defeated them. German military historians, writing in the 1950s and 60s, devoted considerable attention to the American artillery system. They acknowledged their failure to adapt, their doctrinal rigidity, their inability to accept the organizational changes necessary to counter American firepower. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer-Lehr Division and survived the war, wrote in his memoirs, "We were defeated by many factors: American industrial capacity, Allied air superiority, the two-front war against America and Russia simultaneously. But tactically, on the ground, what defeated us most immediately was their artillery system. We could not move without being observed. We could not concentrate without being destroyed. We could not establish defenses that lasted more than minutes once engaged. This was not superior courage or fighting spirit on the American part. It was a superior system design. They built an organization that could turn observation into destruction faster than we could react. In retrospect, we should have adopted similar methods in 1943 or early 44. By the time we understood what they had done, it was too late." This acknowledgement, rare among German generals seeking to explain their defeat, captures something essential. The Germans weren't defeated by inferior soldiers or even by inferior technology in the narrow sense. They were defeated by their inability to reimagine how warfare worked. They kept fighting with 1940 doctrine in a world that had moved to 1944 reality. The SCR-300 itself became obsolete relatively quickly. By the 1950s, newer radios with better range and reliability replaced it, but the system it enabled forward observers with direct communication to fire support became permanent. Every modern military that aspires to effectiveness has adopted variations of this doctrine. The specific technologies change, but the underlying principle remains constant. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, the United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, dedicated a small memorial to forward observers of World War II. The memorial includes a bronze statue of a soldier kneeling with an SCR-300 radio, hand set to his ear, scanning the horizon. The inscription reads, "They called the fire that won the war." It's a modest memorial, appropriate for a modest innovation. The SCR-300 never captured public imagination the way tanks or fighter aircraft did. It never inspired movies or model kits. It was just a radio, a tool for a specific job, functional rather than glamorous. But wars are won by functional tools used effectively, not by glamorous weapons used poorly. The Germans had the Tiger tank, arguably the finest armoured vehicle of World War II. But Tiger tanks were complex, expensive, difficult to maintain, and produced in small numbers. The Americans had the Sherman tank, inferior in direct combat, but reliable, easy to maintain, and produced by the thousands. The Americans won the tank war not through superior individual vehicles, but through superior logistics and numbers. The same principle applied to the SCR-300. It wasn't the most sophisticated radio possible, but it was reliable, producible in quantity, and embedded in a doctrine that made it devastatingly effective. The Americans won the artillery war not through superior guns. German artillery pieces were generally excellent, but through superior fire direction, superior logistics, and a system that could turn observation into destruction in 15 seconds. There's a broader lesson here about innovation and adaptation. The Germans began World War II as the most innovative military force in the world. Their tactics, their combined arms doctrine, their operational concepts were revolutionary. But innovation isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous process of adaptation, of questioning assumptions, of being willing to change when confronted with new realities. The Germans innovated brilliantly in 1939 and 1940. Then they stopped. They refined their existing approaches, but they didn't fundamentally reimagine them. They kept fighting the war they'd prepared for, even as the war changed around them. The Americans, by contrast, entered the war technologically and doctrinally behind. They lost battles in 1942 and early 1943 because they were still learning. But they learned continuously, adapted constantly, changed their doctrine when it failed, and developed new systems when old ones proved inadequate. The SCR-300 forward observer system was just one example of this adaptive capacity, but it was representative of a broader approach. This capacity for self-correction, for institutional learning, for admitting mistakes and changing course, proved more valuable than any single technological advantage. The Germans had better tanks in many respects, better machine guns, better general-purpose artillery pieces. But they lost because they couldn't adapt their systems fast enough to counter American innovations. The 15 seconds it took to transmit a fire mission, those brief moments of calm speech in the chaos of combat, represented the difference between a military that could learn and one that could not. The Germans heard those transmissions, knew something had changed, but couldn't abandon their doctrine quickly enough to respond. And in that failure to adapt, in that adherence to traditional methods despite clear evidence of their inadequacy, lay the seeds of defeat. In the end, the story of the SCR-300 is not really about a radio at all. It's about organizational culture, about trust, about the willingness to empower junior leaders and accept the risks that come with that empowerment. It's about the difference between a military that values control and one that values speed, between one that fears mistakes and one that accepts them as the price of effectiveness. The Germans never knew, not really, not until too late, that 15 seconds of speech and 38 pounds of equipment had transformed warfare. They suspected technology, imagined secret weapons, hypothesized complex detection systems. They never imagined the answer was simple. Trust a lieutenant with a radio and let him call the fire. That simplicity, that radical trust in junior leaders, that willingness to decentralize authority in pursuit of speed, this was the true innovation. The radio was just the tool that made it possible. And sometimes, in warfare as in life, the side that trusts its people defeats the side that trusts its systems. Sometimes the army that empowers sergeants defeats the army that waits for generals. Sometimes 15 seconds of faith in a forward observer is worth more than an hour of careful staff planning. The Germans learned this lesson, but they learned it too late, in defeat, in retrospect, when understanding could no longer change the outcome. The Americans learned it in time to win, and that difference measured in seconds, transmitted over simple radios, executed by junior officers, armed with nothing but training and trust, made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.